The night pressed in without making a sound. Inside the tent, the air felt heavier than it should have, as if the dark itself had weight. The candles burned low, their flames steady, refusing even the small comfort of flicker. Outside, the camp had gone quiet, not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the careful stillness of men who know that morning will demand something from them. The king lay awake. Sleep had abandoned him hours ago, slipping away as soon as his thoughts turned inward. He listened to the distant sounds of the river beyond the meadow, to the muted steps of guards changing watch, to the slow, patient breathing of a world that did not seem concerned with his authority. There was no battle outside his tent, no enemy advancing, no shouts, no steel, no chaos. And yet he felt surrounded. This was a different kind of siege, one without weapons, one that closed in through silence and waiting. The kind that does not threaten the body, but the idea of power itself. The kind that leaves a man alone with the question he has avoided for too long. What if tomorrow, saying no is no longer enough? The king turned slightly, the fabric of the tent whispering as it shifted. For most of his life, that whisper would have meant nothing. Everything had answered to him then. Words, land, men, law. Tonight, the whisper felt like a warning. Beyond the canvas walls, others were awake too, not plotting an attack, not sharpening swords, simply waiting, calm, resolved, unmoving. That knowledge unsettled him more than open rebellion ever had, because armies can be crushed. Waiting cannot. And in that quiet, as the night deepened and sleep refused to come, the king began to understand that by morning, something older than force would stand in front of him. Not violence, not defeat, but a limit. He did not name it. Not aloud. Not even in his thoughts. Some ideas grow stronger the moment they are spoken, and this one felt dangerous enough without a name. It hovered at the edge of his mind, present but undefined, like a shadow that refused to take shape. There was something waiting for him at dawn. Not a battle, not a demand shouted across a field, not even a clear threat. It was worse than that. It was an agreement already formed without him. The king had spent his life believing that power moved outward, from the crown to the land, from command to obedience. Tonight, for the first time, he sensed it moving the other way. Quietly, patiently, gathering where he could not reach it. Outside the tent, the barons did not sleep either. They did not pace. They did not argue. They did not need to. Their calm was not uncertainty. It was resolution. They had arrived at something together, and that unity pressed against the canvas walls more firmly than any army. The king understood unity. He had ruled by dividing it. But this was different. This was not rebellion fueled by anger. It was pressure built from exhaustion. Years of loss, debt, humiliation, and fear compressed into a single, immovable idea. An idea that required no shouting to be felt. He closed his eyes, hoping for rest, but the darkness only sharpened his thoughts. Somewhere beyond the river, the night moved on, unconcerned with crowns or lineage. Time, it seemed, had chosen a side. By morning, he would be asked to accept something that could not be undone. Not because it was perfect, not because it was just, but because once an idea like this exists, refusing it does not erase it. The king opened his eyes again. He still did not name the thing waiting for him, but he could feel its shape now, and he knew the night would not let him forget it. The longest nights are the ones that know the morning matters. As the hours thinned, the king sensed the approach of something irreversible, not as fear, but as certainty. The kind that settles without asking permission. He had lived through battles that threatened his life, through rebellions that challenged his rule. Those dangers had shape. They could be met, delayed, crushed. This had no shape. It was not coming to take his crown. It was coming to change what the crown meant. He stared at the dim ceiling of the tent, aware that the symbols around him, gold, seal, title, were suddenly lighter than they had been yesterday. Not gone. Not useless. Just different. As if they were about to share their weight with something else. Outside, the river moved on, steady and indifferent. The meadow lay quiet, waiting to host a meeting that would not look like a turning point. No ceremony. No triumph. Just men standing close enough to hear one another breathe. By morning, no one would cheer. By morning, no city would fall. By morning, the world would look almost exactly the same. And yet, something fundamental would shift. The king understood this with a clarity that surprised him. Power would not vanish. It never does. But it would be named, measured, pressed into words that could be held against him later. For the first time, power would be asked to explain itself. That thought followed him as the sky began to pale, as the night loosened its grip and the camp stirred awake. He rose, already knowing that sleep would not come before the decision did. This was the night when force learned it could be resisted without a sword. This was the night when authority met its first quiet boundary. And by morning, the world would begin to remember that moment, not because it was loud, but because it could not be taken back. The lie we tell about freedom. Most people never wonder why the law exists. It feels like air present, invisible, unquestioned. We grow up assuming rules were always there, that limits on power are part of the natural order. Courts, rights, protections. The idea that no one stands above the law feels so obvious that it barely registers as an achievement. But it is one. For most of human history, law was not something that stood apart from power. It was power. It spoke with one voice, wore one crown, and ended where obedience ended. If the ruler decided, the decision became truth. If the ruler changed his mind, the truth changed with it. That was the world before this night. There were customs, traditions, promises, but none of them could stop a king who chose not to listen. Limits existed only as long as power allowed them to exist. Freedom, as we understand it today, had no language yet. That is the lie we tell ourselves. That freedom emerged naturally. That law evolved gently. That restraint was inevitable. It was not. It had to be forced into existence, slowly, reluctantly, and at first, almost by accident. And it began on a night when no one spoke about freedom at all. only survival, only pressure, only the quiet realization that something had gone too far, and that doing nothing was no longer safer than doing something unthinkable. This is where the story truly begins, not with rights, not with justice, but with a world that did not yet know either, and a night that would make it impossible to forget them once they appeared. Imagine a world where disagreement has no appeal, no court to turn to, no document to reference, no higher rule to invoke. If the king speaks, the matter is settled. This was not tyranny, as later generations would describe it. It was normal, expected, logical. Power was personal, because the world itself was personal small, fragile, dependent on force and loyalty to survive. A single will at the center felt safer than uncertainty. In that world, justice did not ask whether something was fair. It asked who had decided. Promises existed, but only as long as they were convenient. Traditions mattered, but only until they interfered with command. Even faith, which claimed moral authority, bent when it collided with the needs of the crown. This is why what happened next was so dangerous, because the problem was not that one king ruled too harshly. The problem was that nothing existed to stop any king at all. People did not dream of freedom. They dreamed of mercy, of a ruler who might choose restraint, of a moment when power would decide to be kind. But kindness is temporary. What lasts is structure. And structure was exactly what this world did not yet have. That is the tension of this night. Not a struggle between good and evil. Not heroes against villains. But a quiet collision between a system built on personal authority and the first fragile idea that authority itself might need rules. An idea so new that no one yet trusted it. An idea so small that it could be dismissed as a concession. An idea that, once written down, would refuse to stay small ever again. What makes this night extraordinary is not what people wanted. It is what they were willing to risk. No one gathered by the river dreaming of constitutions or human rights. No one imagined courtrooms, appeals, or phrases like due process. Those ideas belonged to a future that had not yet learned how to think that way. What existed instead was fear, quiet, practical fear. Fear that power had grown careless. Fear that loyalty no longer offered protection. Fear that if nothing changed now, nothing ever would. This is the part history often simplifies. We like to believe that freedom is born from inspiration, from vision, from people reaching upward towards something better. But most lasting change begins differently. It begins when enough people decide that the current order is more dangerous than the unknown. That decision is never heroic. It is uncomfortable, risky, and deeply unsettling. Because once you challenge absolute power, you cannot unthink that challenge. Even if you lose, even if the document is torn up, even if the king takes back his word, the idea remains. That is the quiet danger of this night. By morning, a single man would still wear the crown. Armies would still exist. Castles would still dominate the land. To the outside world, almost nothing would appear different. And yet, the most radical idea in Western political history would now exist in writing. That power itself could be questioned. That authority could be conditional. That law might stand above the person who enforces it. Everything you trust today, every assumption that feels natural, rests on that fragile beginning. A night when no one spoke of freedom, only of limits, and discovered, without fully realizing it, that limits have a way of outliving those who resist them. Part 1. Before there were rights. Before there were rights, there was a voice. Not a law written and reviewed, not a rule debated and refined, but a single voice that carried farther than all others. When it spoke, it did not explain itself. It did not justify. It did not wait for agreement. It simply decided. In this world, order flowed outward from one person. Justice was not blind. It was personal. It had a face, a temper, a memory. What was allowed yesterday could be forbidden tomorrow. What was forgiven for one could be punished in another. And no one asked why. This was not chaos. It was stability of a particular kind. People knew where power lived, even if they didn't know how it would be used. Loyalty mattered more than fairness. Proximity mattered more than principle. If you were close to the crown, the law bent. If you were far from it, the law hardened. That was simply how things worked. Most people did not imagine anything else. Why would they? The idea that authority itself might be constrained would have sounded not just unrealistic, but dangerous. Limits suggested weakness. Weakness invited disorder. Disorder threatened survival. So the voice remained unchallenged until it began to cost too much. Because a system built on a single will works only as long as that will appears reasonable. When it doesn't, when decisions feel arbitrary, punitive, disconnected from reality, the silence beneath the voice starts to change. It becomes listening. And listening, when shared by enough people, becomes pressure. That pressure had been building for years. This night did not create it. It revealed it. And for the first time, the world that had always been ruled by a voice began to wonder, quietly, cautiously, what might happen if the voice were finally answered. For a long time, obedience felt like protection, not because it was fair, but because it was predictable. People learned how to survive by reading the mood of power rather than appealing to any rule above it. You did not ask whether something was just. You asked whether it was permitted today by this ruler under these conditions. That kind of world trains caution, not courage. If a decision harmed you, it was unfortunate, but not illegitimate. If property was taken, if taxes rose, if punishment felt excessive, the response wasn't outrage. It was adjustment. You learned to bend, to endure, to stay unnoticed. Justice, in the modern sense, was a luxury no one could afford to imagine. Because justice implies comparison. Comparison implies standards. And standards imply something even kings must answer to. That was the line no one crossed, so people placed their hope not in law, but in character. They prayed for better rulers, kinder moods, merciful moments. A good king was a blessing. A bad one was a trial to be survived, nothing more. But this system carried a hidden cost. every injustice that went unanswered taught the same lesson: that safety depended not on what was right, but on who held power. Over time, that lesson eroded loyalty, not suddenly, quietly. By this night, obedience no longer felt like protection to those closest to the crown. It felt like exposure, and when obedience stops feeling safe, people begin to imagine something more dangerous than submission. They begin to imagine limits. The idea itself felt dangerous, not rebellion, not resistance, but limitation. To suggest that power should be bound by rules sounded, to many, like inviting collapse. If the king could be told no, what would stop everyone else from saying it too? If authority could be questioned, what would keep order from dissolving into argument and delay? This fear was not imagined. The world they lived in was fragile. Roads were unsafe. Borders were uncertain. Famine and war were never far away. Strong rule felt like a shield against chaos. Even when it cut, it still protected. That is why no one rushed toward change. They endured instead. They told themselves that excesses were temporary, that patience was wiser than disruption. They believed that survival required accepting injustice as the price of stability. And for a long time, that belief held. But fear has a breaking point. When power begins to feel unpredictable rather than strong, limitation stops looking like weakness. It starts to look like insurance. A way to survive not just this ruler, but the next one. And the one after that. That realization does not arrive suddenly. It creeps in through repetition, through losses that no longer feel necessary, through demands that no longer feel connected to protection. By this night, that fear had quietly changed its shape. People were no longer afraid of limiting power. They were afraid of what would happen if they did not. And once that fear takes hold, the world you have always known begins to loosen, just enough to let a new idea in. An idea that says authority does not disappear when it is restrained. It becomes something else, something that can last. Part 2. The king everyone feared. He was not the kind of king history loves to turn into a symbol. He did not arrive wrapped in legend or sharpened by destiny. He was not unusually cruel, nor unusually brave. He was something far more unsettling: a man with power who did not know how to carry it without using it. Those around him feared him, not because he was unpredictable in rage, but because he was consistent in pressure. Taxes rose without apology. Lands were seized without explanation that felt sufficient. Promises were made and unmade as circumstances shifted. None of this was illegal. That was the problem. The king acted within a world where his will defined the rules, and he used that freedom often. To him, authority was not something to be questioned. It was something to be exercised, tested, reaffirmed. But fear grows differently from respect. Respect binds people even when the ruler is absent. Fear requires constant presence, constant enforcement, constant reminder. Over time, that kind of rule exhausts everyone involved, including the one who holds the crown. The king sensed this exhaustion long before this night. He felt it in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, in the way agreements were followed precisely, but without loyalty, in the way obedience arrived quickly and disappeared the moment his attention moved elsewhere. He had power. What he no longer had was trust. And a king without trust must rely on force. A king who relies on force eventually stands alone. This night was not the result of a single failure or decision. It was the quiet outcome of years in which fear replaced allegiance, and authority forgot the difference. The men waiting beyond the river did not hate the king. They no longer believed in him. And that loss, more than any rebellion, is what brought history to this meadow. Loyalty fades long before it breaks. At first, it only changes its tone. People still bow, still agree, still carry out orders. But something essential goes missing beneath the surface: the willingness to defend power when it is not watching. That was happening now. The king had surrounded himself with obedience, not devotion. Men followed his commands because refusing them carried consequences, not because they believed those commands served anything larger than the moment. Fear ensured efficiency, but it hollowed out commitment. He mistook that efficiency for strength. Every demand he made was met, every tax collected, every order enforced. And yet, each compliance carried a small withdrawal of trust. A quiet calculation began to replace allegiance. How much longer can this continue? What will it cost me next? Who protects me if the king decides I am expendable? These questions were never asked aloud. They did not need to be. They traveled through glances, through silences that lingered too long, through the careful way people avoided being noticed. Fear trains people to survive, not to stand. By this night, loyalty had thinned to something brittle. The king could still command bodies, but he could no longer command belief. And belief, once lost, cannot be ordered back into existence. He felt this loss most clearly in isolation, surrounded by advisors who spoke cautiously, by nobles who agreed too quickly, by allies who offered support without warmth. Power remained, but connection did not. That is the quiet tragedy of fear-based rule. It does not collapse in chaos. It empties itself slowly. And when pressure finally arrives from below, from within, from history itself, there is nothing left to absorb it. The men by the river had not come to overthrow a tyrant. They had come because loyalty had already failed. And when loyalty is gone, power discovers, often too late, that it has been standing alone the entire time. By the time the river became a boundary, power had already stopped listening. This was the final symptom, more telling than anger, more dangerous than cruelty. The king could still hear requests, petitions, even warnings. What he could no longer hear was enough. Every demand he made felt reasonable to him, because no rule existed that could say otherwise. When power lacks a stopping point, it mistakes endurance for consent. Men endured for years. They paid. They complied. They waited. The king read that waiting as acceptance. He believed patience meant agreement, that silence meant stability. He did not see the quiet work being done beneath it, the slow alignment of people who had discovered that survival now required unity. This is how standoffs form without confrontation. No speeches, no declarations, just a narrowing of options. On one side stood a crown that could not imagine yielding without collapsing. On the other stood men who could not imagine continuing without losing everything they had left. Neither side felt free to move. That is when power becomes fragile. Not because it is challenged loudly, but because it is challenged collectively. Because it encounters a limit it cannot dismiss, intimidate, or divide. Because the tools it has always relied on no longer produce obedience-only delay. The king sensed this and mistook it for temporary resistance. He told himself it would pass. That firmness would prevail. That authority, once asserted, would restore the old order. But authority that cannot hear enough eventually hears something worse. No, not shouted, not defiant, just present. By this night, that word existed, even if no one had yet spoken it aloud. Part 3. The barons who had nothing left to lose. They didn't gather as heroes. There were no speeches meant for history, no shared vision of a better world, no desire to be remembered kindly. What brought them together was simpler and heavier than that. The quiet knowledge that continuing as before was no longer survivable. For years, each had tried to manage the pressure alone. They paid what was demanded. They absorbed losses meant to be temporary. They told themselves that endurance was wisdom. But endurance has a limit. And that limit had been crossed so gradually that no single moment could be blamed. Lands had shrunk. Influence had thinned. Promises had lost their meaning. What remained was exposure, the sense that no amount of loyalty would protect them from the next demand. This is how resistance actually forms, not in outrage, but in exhaustion. Not in ideology, but in alignment. They did not meet to overthrow the king. That would have been reckless. They met because something older than courage had taken hold. The realization that isolation was now more dangerous than unity. By this night, they understood something power had missed. That pressure does not need drama to become decisive. It only needs enough people to feel it at the same time. And once that happens, silence stops being submission. It becomes preparation. For a long time, waiting had felt responsible. It was safer to delay than to provoke. Safer to hope for moderation than to demand it. Each baron believed that if he endured just a little longer, the pressure might ease, or at least shift elsewhere. That belief kept them apart, cautious, isolated. But waiting has a moment when it turns against you. They began to see it in patterns. The same families targeted again. The same lands reassessed. The same favors revoked without explanation. Waiting no longer spread risk. It concentrated it. What had once felt prudent now felt exposed. This is when calculation changes. When delay stops buying time and starts costing it. When restraint no longer preserves stability, but guarantees loss. Each baron reached this conclusion privately before they reached it together. That private realization mattered, because it meant no one needed convincing. No speeches were required. No ideology had to be shared. The logic was already complete in their minds. Standing alone invited pressure. Standing together redistributed it. Waiting had become dangerous, not because the king was about to act, but because he didn't need to. Power that senses no limit has no reason to stop. And so, quietly, without ceremony, waiting ended. Not in defiance, but in coordination. A shift so subtle it could be missed by anyone still listening for noise. By the time the river became their meeting place, the decision had already been made. Not to win, but to stop losing. Unity was not their first instinct. For men raised on rivalry, on inheritance disputes, and carefully guarded influence, cooperation felt unnatural. Each had learned to protect his position by outmaneuvering others, not by standing beside them. Unity meant exposure, shared risk, shared blame, shared consequence. And yet it became unavoidable. What finally pushed them together was not courage, but mathematics. The simple arithmetic of power. One voice could be ignored. Two could be divided. A few could be punished as examples. But many could not be removed without destabilizing the very system the king depended on. Unity changed the calculation, not morally, strategically. Once gathered, they did not speak loudly. They did not argue ideals. They spoke in short sentences about practical limits, about what had been taken, what could no longer be given, what would happen if nothing changed. There was no romance in the conversation, only recognition. Each man saw his own fear reflected in the others. That reflection mattered. Because fear shared is no longer paralyzing. It becomes directional. It points somewhere. In this case, it pointed toward a single conclusion: that protection would no longer come from favor, patience, or obedience. It would come from standing together. By this night, that standing had already begun. The king had not yet been confronted. No document had been presented. No demand made official. But unity existed now. And unity alters reality before it ever announces itself. This was the moment power shifted, quietly, invisibly, without spectacle. Not because authority was overthrown, but because it encountered something it could not isolate. From this point on, nothing could return to how it had been, even if the king refused, even if force followed, even if the agreement failed. The unity itself could not be undone. And that, more than any clause or seal, was what truly frightened the crown. Perdolpor, the camp at Runnymede. By nightfall, they had gathered at Runnymede. The meadow lay flat and open beside the river, offering no cover and no advantage. An intentional choice. Nothing here suggested triumph. Nothing promised safety. The ground was neutral, exposed, honest in a way courts and castles never were. Mist drifted low over the grass, softening edges, blurring distances. Tents stood in careful lines, not crowded, not celebratory. Fires were kept small, voices stayed low. The river moved steadily, indifferent to titles, carrying the sound of water past men who understood that tomorrow would ask for more than they wanted to give. No one toasted the meeting. No one spoke of victory. This was not a battlefield, but it felt heavier than one. On a battlefield, intentions are clear. Here, everything depended on restraint on words chosen carefully, on the shared understanding that force waited just beyond the conversation. Men walked the perimeter without hurry, measuring the space, as if it might measure them in return. Some stared across the water, not at the opposite bank, but at the reflection faces doubled, outlines uncertain, authority momentarily suspended by the night. This place had been selected because it belonged to no one. That mattered. Power thrives in spaces it owns. It weakens in places where it must negotiate its footing. At Runnymede, the king's authority did not echo from stone walls. It rested on grass that remembered nothing and promised nothing. The mist thickened as the night deepened, and with it came a shared awareness. Whatever happened here would not look dramatic. There would be no charge, no spectacle, no cheering crowd. Just men, a river, and a night that refused to hide what was at stake. This was where waiting turned into presence, and presence, once established, does not leave easily. There was nothing to celebrate. No banners were raised. No horns sounded. Even relief, when it appeared, felt restrained, quickly folded back into caution. The men who had come here understood that celebration would suggest victory, and victory would suggest defeat on the other side. This night required neither. Around the tents, conversation stayed practical. Who would speak first? Who would stand where? How close the river might be allowed to feel. No one asked how history would remember this place. That kind of thinking belonged to safer moments. What passed between them was not excitement, but discipline. They ate little, slept less. Not from fear of attack, but from awareness. This was the kind of night where attention mattered more than strength, where a careless word could undo months of quiet alignment. Across the meadow, the king's presence was felt even when he was not visible. Authority has a gravity of its own. People adjusted their movements instinctively, leaving space where none had been marked. Respect and resentment shared the same silence. If anyone expected tension to explode, they would have been disappointed. The pressure here was inward. Each man carried his own calculation. How far could this go? What would happen if it failed? Who would be blamed? Celebration would have answered those questions too early. It would have pretended that the outcome was already secure. It was not. That uncertainty bound them together more tightly than confidence ever could. They were not here to win. They were here to survive what came next, together or not at all. As the night settled fully over the meadow, one truth became unmistakable. This was not a gathering to demand glory. It was a gathering to impose restraint. And restraint, unlike victory, arrives quietly and leaves nothing to cheer for until long after it has changed everything. By the middle of the night, everyone understood the same thing. There was no way back. Not because a document had been written, not because a demand had been issued, but because the meeting itself now existed. The very act of gathering had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Kings could punish individuals. They could isolate voices. They could even crush rebellions. But they couldn't erase the fact that power had been confronted, calmly, collectively, without violence. That was new. If the barons returned home unchanged, they would return weaker than before. The king would remember who had stood here. Silence would no longer protect them. Waiting would no longer feel neutral. The future, whatever it held, would judge this night as either the beginning of restraint or proof that restraint was impossible. The king faced the same calculation. If he refused entirely, force might still prevail. Armies could still move. Punishments could still be delivered. But something would be lost that force could not restore. The illusion that authority was unquestioned. Once that illusion breaks, it never fully returns. This is the quiet moment history rarely names, the point where no one has spoken yet, but everyone knows that speaking has become unavoidable, where restraint is no longer patience and action no longer feels reckless. Around the meadow, the river continued its steady course, indifferent to the tension it carried alongside. The mist thinned slightly, revealing outlines more clearly. Tents, figures, faces that had chosen to be seen. By this night, no one was pretending this was temporary. Whatever happened at dawn, agreement, resistance, compromise, or conflict, the world on the other side of it would not be the same as the one that had arrived here. The camp at Runnymede was no longer just a place, it was a threshold, and everyone standing there knew that once morning came, they would cross it, whether they wanted to or not. Part 5. Why this was not a revolution. Nothing about this night looked like change. There were no crowds demanding justice, no slogans shouted into the dark, no sense that a new world was about to be born. That is because this was not a revolution. Revolutions announce themselves. They promise renewal. They replace one certainty with another. What unfolded at Runnymede did none of that. It was smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous to the old order, precisely because it did not pretend to be complete. No one here spoke of equality. No one argued for the rights of everyone. No one imagined dismantling the system they lived within. They were not trying to end monarchy. They were trying to survive it. That distinction matters. A revolution seeks to overturn power. This night sought to contain it. The barons did not want a king without authority. They wanted a king with boundaries. A ruler whose decisions could be challenged not by force, but by reference. By something written, something external. Something that would remain even when tempers changed. That idea did not feel inspiring. It felt uncomfortable, because it suggested that no one, not even those gathered here, should be trusted with unchecked control. Not the crown, not the nobles, not anyone. Power, they were beginning to understand, was safest when it was constrained by something impersonal. This was not idealism. It was realism, sharpened by experience. The absence of celebration was not caution, it was honesty. Everyone knew this agreement, whatever form it took, would be fragile. It would be resisted, possibly broken, almost certainly resented. But revolutions collapse when they fail to deliver perfection. Precedents do not. And this night was about establishing a precedent so modest it could survive disappointment. A simple, unsettling idea. That authority could exist and still be limited. That idea did not need cheering. It needed to be written down. What made this night dangerous was how little it demanded. No throne was threatened. No lineage questioned. No grand vision imposed. The barons asked for restraint in specific places. rules that applied in specific moments, obligations that limited certain actions. Taken alone, each concession looked minor, temporary, even reasonable, something a king could grant and later ignore. That was the mistake. Small concessions do not feel like surrender. They feel like compromise. And compromise is how power convinces itself it remains in control. A clause here, a promise there, a written assurance meant to calm the present and preserve the future. But once written, even the smallest limit acquires a memory. It can be cited, compared, repeated. A boundary that exists once can exist again. A promise that is recorded can be measured against behavior. What began as a practical adjustment becomes a reference point. And reference points have a way of multiplying. This is why the night mattered. Not because it demanded everything, but because it demanded something that power could not easily erase. The barons were not naive. They did not expect perfection. They expected resistance, delay, reinterpretation. What they wanted was proof. Proof that authority could be pressed into language, that it could be pinned to words and asked to remain there, even briefly, even imperfectly. History rarely changes by sweeping victories. It changes when a limit is acknowledged for the first time and survives long enough to be remembered. This night planted that limit, not loudly, not heroically, but carefully, in ink and agreement, where it could wait for the future to discover it. Victory ends arguments. Precedent begins them. That is why this night mattered more than any triumph ever could. Nothing here resolved power forever. Nothing settled the future. What it did was far more enduring. It created a reference, a moment that could be pointed to. From now on, whenever authority pushed too far, someone could say, "This has happened before." Whenever power claimed it answered only to itself, someone could answer back, not with force, but with memory. Precedent changes the direction of pressure. Instead of building toward collapse, tension can be redirected toward comparison, toward interpretation, toward debate. That may sound fragile, even ineffective, but it is how systems survive without breaking. This is why revolutions burn bright and fade, and why precedents persist. The men at Runnymede were not trying to win history. They were trying to give it something to hold on to. A thin thread, perhaps, but one strong enough to be grasped again later by people who would need it more than they ever could. They did not imagine courts arguing over these words centuries later. They did not imagine constitutions borrowing their logic. They did not imagine a world where the phrase, "no one is above the law," would sound obvious. They only understood one thing. That power had been forced, once, to pause. And once power pauses, it can be asked to pause again. That is not revolution. It is something quieter, something far more difficult to erase. Pornoin, Perblix, the night the king realized he could not win. Power teaches its holders a dangerous lesson, that if something has worked before, it will work again. The king had relied on force for years, not always openly, not always with violence, but with the quiet certainty that resistance could be outlasted. Delay them, divide them, exhaust them. Authority, he believed, would eventually reassert itself simply by remaining firm. That confidence had carried him through crises before. Not tonight. As the night deepened, the familiar tools no longer felt reliable. Threats would escalate the situation rather than end it. Punishment would unify opposition rather than scatter it. Even refusal, his most instinctive response, would only harden what now stood before him. For the first time, strength felt like friction. The king understood something unsettling. The pressure he faced did not need to defeat him to succeed. It only needed to remain, to wait, to be present without breaking. His power could strike, but it could not dissolve what had formed across the river. That realization is rare for those who rule. It arrives not as fear, but as calculation. A sudden shift from, "Can I stop this?" to "What happens if I try?" And in that shift, the answer becomes clear enough to avoid saying aloud. He could still win a battle. He could not win the night. Because this confrontation did not depend on momentum or surprise. It depended on endurance, on unity, on the refusal to disperse. And those qualities were now held by the men who waited, not by the crown. The king sat with that knowledge as the hours passed, aware that each moment of delay strengthened the thing he most wanted to deny. By morning, force would still exist, but its certainty would not. And once certainty leaves power, victory stops being absolute and starts becoming conditional. This was the night the king realized that winning no longer meant getting his way. It meant choosing how much of his authority would survive what came next. Armies solve problems that can be pointed at. A city, a border, a rival banner. What waited at Runnymede could not be pointed at in the same way. The king still had soldiers. He still had the means to enforce obedience. If he chose, he could scatter the men gathered by the river, punish leaders, remind the country who commanded force. But force would not end what had formed. It would only expose it. An army can crush resistance, but it cannot erase agreement. It cannot make people unsee what they have seen together. Once unity exists, violence does not restore authority. It changes its meaning. Power shifts from being accepted to being endured. The king understood this instinctively. If he moved troops now, he would confirm the very fear that had brought the barons together. That authority no longer protected, but threatened. Soldiers might win the field, but they would lose the future. Every command afterward would be obeyed with calculation, not loyalty. Even worse, force would turn a contained moment into a permanent fracture. The dispute would stop being about limits and become about survival. What had been pressure would become resistance. What had been negotiation would become precedent of a different kind. One that taught people that power listens only to violence. That lesson would not benefit the crown, so the army remained still. Not because the king lacked strength, but because he understood, finally, where strength stopped working. The night had shifted the rules without announcing them, and by the time he noticed, it was already too late to return to the old ones. This was the realization that stripped power of its illusions, that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is not an enemy you can defeat, but a situation you can only manage. And this night demanded management, not domination, which meant that for the first time, the king would have to choose restraint, not as mercy, but as survival. There is a moment when power discovers it is alone, not abandoned, surrounded, attended, obeyed, but isolated in a way no command can fix. The king felt that isolation settle over him as the night thinned. Advisors offered careful words. Messengers waited for instruction. Guards stood ready. All the mechanisms of authority remained in place. What was missing was assurance. No one could tell him this would pass. No one could promise that refusal would restore order. No one could say with certainty that force would make tomorrow easier. Power had brought him here. Power had sustained him. And now, power offered no clear path forward. This is the loneliest position a ruler can occupy, when every option carries loss, and choosing nothing is itself a choice. When strength no longer simplifies decisions, but complicates them. When the future begins to feel heavier than the past. The king understood, in that quiet, that compromise was not weakness, but selection. He could not preserve everything. He could only decide what would survive the night. To yield entirely would unravel authority. To refuse entirely would harden resistance. Between those outcomes lay something narrow and uncomfortable. Agreement. Not because it was right. Not because it was generous. But because it was the only path that did not end, with the crown diminished beyond repair. This was not courage. It was clarity. As dawn approached, the king prepared himself for a concession he would later resent. He did not yet know the words. He did not need to. The shape of the decision was already clear. He would allow limits, briefly, reluctantly, imperfectly, because the alternative was a future where limits would be taken, not offered. That is the moment history rarely describes. The moment when power does not fall, but steps back just enough to survive, and in doing so, changes everything. Part 7. A document that was never meant to last. What emerged from that night was not a vision. It was a solution, a narrow one, practical, carefully limited, the kind designed to calm a crisis rather than reshape a world. The men involved did not speak of permanence. They spoke of relief, of restoring balance long enough to breathe again. This was not meant to endure. The king did not imagine binding himself forever. The barons did not imagine securing a final victory. Both sides believed they were buying time. A pause. A way to step back from a confrontation that neither could afford to push further. That belief shaped everything. The words were chosen not for elegance, but for containment. Specific grievances, specific limits, specific promises tied to specific behaviors. Nothing abstract, nothing universal. Nothing that sounded like an idea meant to travel beyond this moment. It was, in every sense, provisional. That is why it worked. Had it claimed too much, it would have been rejected outright. Had it promised too little, it would have failed immediately. Its power lay in how modest it appeared, how easily it could be mistaken for a concession that history would forget. The king could tell himself it would be revised. The barons could tell themselves it would be enforced. Both could believe they had not surrendered the future. Neither understood that the future had just been given something it could return to. This is how enduring change often enters the world. Not announced, not celebrated, but accepted, briefly, reluctantly, as a temporary measure meant to solve a problem that felt urgent and local. The document was never meant to last. That is precisely why it did. When the words were finally set down, no one paused to imagine centuries. Ink met parchment under the weight of the present, not the pull of posterity. Hands moved with caution, not ceremony. Faces remained guarded. This was not a moment people wanted to linger in. It was something to be finished, concluded, set aside. The king did not read destiny into the clauses. The barons did not see a foundation being laid. They saw leverage. Each side focused on what the document would do tomorrow, how it would slow demands, how it would restrain excess, how it would restore a sense, however fragile, of predictability. The future, if it was considered at all, was assumed to be pliable, amendable, forgettable. That assumption felt reasonable. Agreements had been made before and quietly abandoned after. Promises had been recorded and later reinterpreted. Words could be bent. Clauses could be ignored. Authority, they believed, would eventually reassert itself through familiarity and time. What they underestimated was memory. Not human memory, which fades and reshapes itself, but recorded memory. Words that could be carried elsewhere, copied, repeated, compared against actions taken later. Once something is written, it no longer depends entirely on those who created it. It can outlive them. No one present imagined judges arguing over these lines. No one imagined future rulers being measured against a night by a river they had never seen. No one imagined people far removed from crowns and barons finding protection in language meant to settle a private crisis. They signed because the moment demanded it. They moved on because they believed the moment would pass. And in doing so, they left behind something far more durable than they intended. A trace of limitation that could be returned to long after everyone involved assumed it had been forgotten. History often turns not on what people hope for, but on what they fail to notice while trying to survive. The king's hand did not tremble, not because he felt calm, but because he felt finished with the moment. This was not an act of faith. It was an act of containment. A way to close a door that had been left open too long. A way to move past a confrontation he intended to revisit later. On his terms. He did not believe the words would bind him. Why would he? Power had always found ways around ink. Clauses could be reinterpreted. Enforcement could be delayed. Circumstances could be declared exceptional. A document could exist without truly existing, acknowledged when convenient, ignored when not. The barons understood this risk. They did not mistake the signature for trust. They did not imagine goodwill had suddenly appeared. What they saw instead was something subtler and more valuable: acknowledgement. The king had agreed, publicly and in writing, that limits could exist at all. Belief was not required for that. Only admission. This is where many agreements fail. and where this one survived. It did not depend on sincerity. It depended on visibility. Once the signature was placed, the idea it represented could no longer be denied without effort. And effort leaves traces. The king intended to undo this later. The barons expected him to try. Neither side believed the document would last. But belief was never the engine of its power. The signature mattered not because it was honest, but because it was recorded. Because it created a moment that could be pointed to, repeated, and revived whenever authority pushed too far again. In that sense, the document did not need loyalty. It only needed time. And time, once given a reference, has a way of returning to it, again and again, long after those who dismissed it are gone. Subpart 8. What changed before the ink dried? The change did not wait for enforcement. It did not wait for courts, or judges, or even for obedience. It happened the moment power acknowledged out loud and in writing that it could be constrained. That acknowledgement mattered more than compliance ever could. Before this night, authority had flowed in one direction. Even when rulers made promises, those promises were framed as generosity. They could be withdrawn, revised, forgotten. What changed here was not the behavior of power, but its position. For the first time, power stood next to something else, not above it, not beyond it, next to words that did not belong to a person. That subtle shift altered everything. It meant that authority was no longer self-justifying. It could be measured against something external, something that did not breathe, did not age, did not change its mind. Ink does not negotiate. Once that comparison exists, it cannot be erased by force alone. Even if the agreement is broken, even if it is ignored, even if it is mocked. The idea that authority can be tested against a standard survives every violation. This is why the ink mattered before it dried. Because from that moment on, power could not pretend limits were impossible. It had accepted them once. And what has been accepted can be demanded again. The king did not lose his crown that night. The barons did not gain freedom. But the future gained a question it had never been able to ask before. By what right? That question would echo far beyond the meadow. It would wait quietly in times of calm and rise sharply in moments of crisis. It would outlive kings, barons, wars, and even the document itself. All because, for a brief moment, authority admitted it was not absolute. And once that admission exists, nothing returns to how it was before. Something subtle but permanent shifted that night. Before, law had lived inside the person of the king. It moved with him, changed with him, ended where his patience ended. After this moment, law stepped just slightly outside the crown, close enough to serve it, distant enough to judge it. That distance was everything. It meant decisions could be compared, not just obeyed. It meant promises could be recalled, not just remembered. It meant authority could be questioned without immediately becoming rebellion. This did not make the world fair. It made it arguable. From now on, power would have to explain itself, even if only briefly, even if only to delay resistance. And explanation changes behavior. It slows impulse. It invites scrutiny. It creates space where none existed before. The king still ruled. Orders were still given. Punishments were still enforced. But beneath all of it, something had moved. Law was no longer identical to the will of one man. It had become something that could outlast him. Something that could be pointed to when memory failed or courage faltered. That separation was fragile. It would be tested. It would be ignored. It would be challenged again and again. But it existed. And once law exists outside the crown, it begins a journey power can never fully reverse, only resist, reinterpret, or reluctantly accept. The ink was barely dry. Yet the distance had already been created, and history would spend centuries learning how to widen it. Nothing visible changed that day. The same men rode home. The same crown traveled with the king. The same castles watched the same roads. And yet, something had entered the world that could not be removed. Not by force. Not by denial. Not by time. A limit had been learned. Not perfected. Not enforced consistently. But recognized. That recognition could not be taken back. Even if the document were ignored tomorrow, even if its promises were broken, even if its words were declared invalid, the knowledge would remain. Power had once paused. Authority had once agreed that it could be bound, and that memory would surface whenever pressure returned. This is why the night mattered more than the morning. Mornings are about outcomes. Nights are about realizations. By night, those gathered had learned something about power that no battle could have taught them. That it is strongest when unquestioned, and most vulnerable the moment it admits a boundary. From this point on, resistance would not need to invent itself from nothing. It could reach backward. It could say, "This has happened before." It could remind rulers that limitation was not chaos, it was precedent. Precedent does not shout. It waits. And when it is needed again, it appears fully formed, carrying the quiet authority of having existed once already. The ink may have dried slowly, but the limit it marked had already set, and once a limit exists in memory, power can never again claim that it is impossible. Part 9. Why this night still rules the world. What happened by the river did not stay there. It could not, because it was not tied to place, language, or allegiance. It was an idea light enough to be carried, quiet enough to survive defeat, and practical enough to be reused whenever power pressed too far. The idea was simple. That authority must answer to something other than itself. It did not move quickly. Ideas like this never do. They move the way water does, finding cracks, seeping into places that look solid, waiting for pressure to return. Each time it was needed, it appeared not as a demand, but as a reference. This has been done before. That sentence would echo across centuries, across courts, where judges searched for justification beyond command, across assemblies, where lawmakers argued about restraint rather than loyalty, across oceans, into places that had never heard of that meadow, but understood its logic immediately. By the time new societies began to imagine government as something written rather than inherited, this night was already there, embedded in the assumption that law could stand apart from power, that rules could bind the hands that enforce them, that legitimacy could depend on agreement, not just force. To modern ears, this sounds ordinary. That is its triumph. The most powerful ideas stop sounding radical once they become invisible. They turn into expectations, into instincts, into phrases that feel so natural they no longer feel historical at all. But every time someone insists that no one is above the law, they are reaching back to this night, whether they know it or not. Not to the document itself, not to the men who signed it, but to the moment when power learned it could be limited, and the world learned it could remember that lesson and reuse it. That is why this night still rules the world, not because it ended anything, but because it began a habit history never managed to break. The men who stood at the river did not imagine a chain reaction. They imagined relief. What they could not see was how easily their compromise could be translated. Once an idea can be expressed without relying on a specific ruler, it becomes portable. It can be removed from its original setting and applied somewhere else, under different conditions, by people with entirely different concerns. That is how this night traveled, not as English history, not as a medieval agreement, but as a principle. Centuries later, when distant societies began to wrestle with the same problem, how to restrain power without destroying it, they did not need to reinvent the logic. They reached for something already tested, something that had survived kings who tried to undo it. The idea crossed borders quietly. It appeared in charters, petitions, legal arguments, and eventually constitutions. Each time it was adapted, simplified, argued over, and imperfectly applied. But the core remained intact. Authority must explain itself to something beyond its own will. For audiences today, especially in places like the United States, this connection feels foundational rather than historical. Courts, checks, and balances, written law. These are not viewed as innovations. They are assumed. That assumption is the legacy of this night. A world where law stands above individuals did not emerge fully formed. It was assembled piece by piece, using moments like this as anchors. Without those anchors, later systems would have drifted toward the same old certainty. That power needs no justification. This is why the night still matters. Because whenever a society asks how to limit authority without chaos, it is walking a path first cleared here. Quietly, reluctantly, without knowing how far it would lead. And that path, once opened, never truly closes. The sentence itself came much later. The words were refined, shortened, translated, argued over. But the meaning was already there, waiting. It had been present that night by the river, even if no one spoke it aloud. No one is above the law. This idea feels obvious now. So obvious that it is easy to forget how unnatural it once was. For most of history, power did not sit beneath rules. Rules bent around power. They followed it, adjusted to it, disappeared when it demanded. What changed at Runnymede was not enforcement. It was orientation. Authority was turned, just slightly, towards something that did not belong to it. That turn made it possible, centuries later, for courts to exist independently, for constitutions to be written as limits rather than permissions, for leaders to be questioned without the question itself becoming treason. For an American audience, this idea sits at the center of civic identity. The assumption that leaders are constrained, that power can be challenged through law rather than force, feels foundational. But foundations are built. They are not discovered. This night is one of those buried layers. When judges cite precedent, when citizens appeal decisions, when institutions survive leaders rather than collapse with them, they are living inside a structure that began here. Not perfectly, not completely, but decisively. The phrase may sound modern. The idea is medieval, and it still rules because it does something rare in history. It restrains power without requiring its destruction. It allows authority to exist, but not to stand alone. It creates continuity instead of cycles of collapse. That is why this night endures. Not as a story people retell often, but as an assumption they rely on every day, without knowing when it first entered the world. And it entered quietly, by a river, at night, when no one was trying to change everything, only trying to stop things from getting worse. Part 10. Freedom did not begin here, but it learned to speak. Freedom did not arrive fully formed that night. It did not announce itself. It did not claim universality. It did not promise equality. What appeared instead was something far more modest and far more durable. A voice. Not the voice of the people. Not the voice of justice, but the voice of restraint. For the first time, power had been asked to pause and answer. Not to surrender, but to explain. Not to disappear, but to acknowledge that it could be measured against something other than itself. That was enough. Freedom does not begin with rights. It begins with limits. With the uncomfortable realization that authority must be prevented from expanding simply because it can. That realization came here, quietly, wrapped in compromise and dissatisfaction. No one left that meadow feeling liberated. The barons did not gain control of their lives. The king did not lose control of the realm. The people did not wake to a new order. And yet, something essential had learned how to speak. A language of constraint, a vocabulary of reference. A way to say this goes too far without reaching for a weapon. That language would grow slowly. It would be misused, ignored, twisted to serve interests it was never meant to protect. But it would survive because it did not rely on idealism. It relied on memory. The memory that power had once been forced to listen. And once that memory exists, freedom no longer has to shout to be heard. It is tempting to look backward and search for the moment freedom was born. But freedom rarely begins that way. It does not arrive as a promise fulfilled. It arrives as a restriction, imposed an insistence that power must stop somewhere, even if no one agrees yet on where that stopping point should be. Before people can demand rights, authority must first accept boundaries. That is what happened here. The agreement at Runnymede did not empower the many. It constrained the one. It did not lift people upward. It pressed power downward, just enough to create space. That space was narrow, uneven, easily abused, but it existed, and existence matters more than intention. Once power is forced to operate within limits, even reluctantly, those limits begin to shape expectations. People start to notice when authority exceeds them. They begin to compare actions to words. They learn to recognize overreach not as fate, but as violation. This is how freedom grows, slowly, indirectly, often without being named. Liberation movements would come much later. Appeals to equality, representation, and consent would follow centuries afterward. None of them would start from nothing. Each would inherit the quiet logic established here, that power is not sacred simply because it is powerful. For an American audience, this distinction is crucial. The freedoms that feel fundamental today did not emerge from a single revolution of ideals. They emerged from a long chain of limitations, each one forcing authority to give ground it would never willingly return. This night did not free anyone, but it made freedom possible by teaching power how to stop, even when it did not want to. And that lesson, once learned, proved impossible to forget. What was written by the river was not an answer. It was a beginning, a first sentence in a conversation that would last centuries, a conversation about how power should behave, who it should answer to, and what happens when it forgets. That sentence was incomplete, uneven, and deeply flawed, but it existed, and once spoken, it invited response. From that point on, authority could be questioned without immediately being destroyed. Limits could be argued over rather than fought over. Disputes could move from fields and fortresses into words, interpretations, and references. This changed the rhythm of history, not all at once, not everywhere, but gradually, persistently, wherever the idea took root. Freedom learned to speak in this way, not as a demand shouted into the void, but as a claim grounded in memory. You agreed to this once. You accepted this limit before. You cannot pretend it never happened. That is how power is taught, not by overthrow alone, but by being reminded again and again of a moment when it acknowledged something greater than itself. The night at Runnymede did not solve injustice. It did not guarantee fairness. It did not protect everyone equally. What it did was far more subtle. It taught future generations how to argue with authority without tearing the world apart. And once a society learns that skill, it never fully loses it, no matter how often it is tested. The conversation begun that night would wander. It would stall. It would regress. But it would continue. Because freedom, once it learns how to speak, does not need to be loud to be heard. It only needs to be remembered. Part 11. The Kingdom That Went to Sleep. Absolute. Morning arrived quietly. No bells rang, no crowds gathered, no messenger rode ahead to announce a new age. England woke as it always had. Fields waiting, roads stretching on, villages beginning their daily routines. To anyone watching from afar, nothing appeared changed. The same crown rested on the same head. The same banners marked the same authority. That appearance mattered. power depends on continuity. It survives by looking uninterrupted, by making change seem cosmetic rather than structural. And on this morning, continuity held. The kingdom still looked absolute. But beneath that surface, something had shifted just enough to matter. The agreement made by the river did not ripple outward in celebration. It settled inward into expectations not yet spoken. Men carried it home not as triumph, but as reference. Something to be remembered later, when needed. Something to return to if pressure resumed. The king, too, returned to rule as before, issuing orders, enforcing authority, maintaining the posture of command. He did not announce limitation. He did not explain concession. To do so would have been to acknowledge weakness. So the kingdom went to sleep that night as it always had, absolute in form, unchanged in appearance. And yet, for the first time, power rested beside something that did not belong to it, something that could be recalled, compared, invoked. The world did not notice. History rarely does at first, because the most durable changes do not arrive as disruptions. They arrive as quiet additions, folded into the ordinary, waiting for the moment when they are needed again. That is how the kingdom went to sleep. Still absolute, but no longer alone. No one felt liberated. The fields did not change hands. Taxes did not vanish. Punishments did not suddenly soften. For most people, life continued exactly as it had the day before. Authority still arrived in familiar ways, through messengers, demands, obligations that did not ask permission. The agreement made by the river did not reach them as relief. It reached them, if at all, as rumor, and that was intentional. This night was never meant to be felt immediately. It was not designed to comfort. It was designed to endure. Those who had shaped it understood that freedom announced too loudly invites destruction. A limit introduced quietly has time to settle. So nothing dramatic followed. The king did not behave differently because he believed in restraint. The barons did not behave differently because they trusted him. Everyone behaved differently because something now existed that had not existed before. A reference. A memory that could be returned to when pressure resumed, when patience ran out, when obedience once again began to feel dangerous. That delay mattered, because freedom does not arrive as a feeling. It arrives as a possibility, as the knowledge that when power pushes too far, there is something to point to besides force or despair. On this morning, no one woke up grateful. No one spoke of rights. No one imagined the long future that would trace itself back to this night. And that is why it worked. Because expectations did not rise faster than reality. Because disappointment did not have time to destroy what had barely begun. Because the idea was allowed to remain quiet, untested, and therefore alive. The kingdom did not feel different, but it had learned something new, something it would remember later, when it mattered far more than it did now. Authority thrives on the appearance of permanence. As long as power looks uninterrupted, it feels unquestionable. And on this night, the illusion held. Orders still carried weight. Titles still commanded deference. The machinery of rule moved forward without visible hesitation. That illusion wasn't accidental. both sides understood its value. The king needed the world to believe nothing essential had shifted. The barons needed time for memory to settle, for the moment to become reference rather than rumor. Neither wanted the fragile balance disturbed by attention, so power wore its old shape. But shapes can deceive. Beneath the surface, something had been introduced that power could not fully control: comparison. From now on, actions would not stand alone. They would be weighed quietly, internally, against a moment when authority had paused and agreed to be measured. That comparison did not weaken power immediately. It changed how power was perceived, and perception, once altered, does not revert easily. The kingdom went to sleep believing it was unchanged, believing authority remained absolute because it looked absolute, because no one said otherwise, because the rhythms of command continued uninterrupted. But absoluteness had acquired a flaw, a small one, almost invisible, the kind that does not break systems outright, but ensures they can never again claim perfection. The kind that waits patiently for pressure to return. Power did not fall asleep worried. It fell asleep unaware that it had been joined, quietly, permanently, by something that would never leave its side. A memory, a limit, a measure. And measures, once introduced, are never fully forgotten. Part 12. And woke up, governed by law. By morning, nothing looked different. The roads were the same. The fields waited as they always had. The crown still rested where it belonged. And yet, the kingdom had crossed something it could not uncross. What had happened by the river did not announce itself as governance. There were no institutions ready to enforce it, no courts prepared to defend it, no officials trained to interpret it. The world did not suddenly become orderly or fair, but it became measurable. From this point forward, authority would live with a comparison it could never fully escape. Every command would exist alongside a memory. Every demand would be weighed, if only privately, against a moment when power had agreed it was not limitless. That is what it means to wake up governed by law. Not that law controls everything, not that justice prevails, but that power no longer stands alone. The men who left Runnymede did not feel triumphant. They felt uncertain, exposed, dissatisfied. The king did not feel defeated. He felt constrained, irritated, unfinished. No one believed the future had been settled, and yet it had been altered. The shift was not in who ruled, but in how rule could be understood. Authority had acquired a frame, a reference, a standard that could be returned to long after those present were gone. That is why this night endures. Because the most important changes in history do not always announce themselves with sound or spectacle. Sometimes they arrive quietly, disguised as compromise, mistaken for delay. And then, one day, generations later, people discover they are living inside a structure that began with a tired king, a silent meadow, and a night when power learned it could be limited and survive. The kingdom went to sleep believing itself absolute. It woke governed by law, and the world has been learning how to live with that idea ever since.